Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second of our clinical conversations for 2022. My name's Clare Ryan and I'm going to moderate the session for you today. My role with Take Two is I'm the team leader of the clinical practice development team. So this forum aims broadly, we're sort of delivering these forums to bring together people who work with infants, children and young people and families who have experienced trauma, so that we can kind of explore with you some key elements of child and family focused trauma-informed practice. So we really hope that this forum's thought-provoking for you and it gives you some practical ideas to take away for your own work. We really want these clinical conversations to be practice focused and to give all of you, regardless of your roles across the various sectors that you're joining from, we want to give you some sort of ideas for your practice so that you can be trauma-informed and developmentally informed in your interactions with the kids and families that you work with. So let me start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the traditional custodians of the land, skies and waterways across Australia. Today, we wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country, so I'd like to pay respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of these lands, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands that you're all joining from today. And it's really lovely to see people in the chat thread identifying the country that you're joining from. That's wonderful to see. Someone's just joined from the Philippines. That's very, very exciting. Okay, so let me just talk very briefly about Take Two. For those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with Take Two, Take Two is a service that sits within the umbrella of Berry Street. Berry Street's one of the largest organisation or non-government organisations in Victoria, Australia, and Take Two is one of the services that sits within Berry Street. Take Two is primarily funded by the Victorian State Government, and it's an intensive therapeutic service that was set up nearly 20 years ago to work with infants, children and young people who have experienced trauma, and particularly the trauma of abuse and neglect and family violence, and primarily children who are involved in the Child Protection Service in Victoria, but we do work with some children and families who also aren't involved in child protection services. And part of the Take Two practice framework as a trauma-informed program is that we are site certified in Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics, which we refer to as the NMT. And that's an approach that was developed by Bruce Perry, who's a psychiatrist in the United States, and it's approach to inform clinical intervention with children who have experienced trauma. So it helps us in Take Two, it sort of helps us think about what we're assessing when we're assessing the child, and it helps us to then develop an understanding of the child's developmental and relational needs, and primarily it then informs the sequence of interventions that we put in place for and with the child and the family. So you'll hear reference to some of the sort of concepts that we draw on from Dr. Perry's model today. Okay, so if we can just move to the next slide, thank you. So today's presentation is based on our latest practice guide, which is called The Crucial Connections, Understanding a Child's Relational Health. We're delivering we're hopefully publishing 3 of these practice guides this year. We already released one. We actually released it last year, but we promoted it in our first clinical conversation at the start of this year on engaging children. And this is the second of those practice guides. And each practice guide is aligned with one of these clinical conversations forums. So we will be delivering another one of these sessions later this year. So we really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter, the Relate e-newsletter, and we'll provide that link at the end of the session if you haven't already received it, to get updates on exactly when the next clinical conversation will be and what the practice guide is going to look like. And you can see the link there to download the practice guide that we're going to be referring to today. And Jen, I think, is going to upload that. Oh, she's already uploaded it into the chat thread. So have a look for that if you haven't already seen it. The other thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was in 2021, so last year, Take Two authored an article published in the Frontiers in Psychiatry journal, which demonstrated the positive impact of the interventions that we deliver in Take Two on the relational health of the children with whom we work. So that phrase relational health, you're going to be hearing that a lot today, and it's one of the really underpinning principles that we work to in Take Two, which is that relationships are the key to healing from trauma. Relationships are also the key to how children develop and how we all kind of reach our potential in life is via healthy, safe, predictable relationships. Okay, so, and Jen's also put in the chat thread the link to that journal article as well. So in terms of what's this session going to look like today? So it's being recorded as we speak. So as it says there, you're welcome to turn your camera off. And if you don't want to have your name on the screen, that's absolutely fine. The chat thread doesn't form part of the recording that then gets distributed out to people. So, you know, the chat thread remains just sort of within this session. So what we'll be doing, we're running for 2 hours, so we'll finish by 11:30 on the dot. The first half of the session is going to be a presentation on the kind of principles that are included in the practice guide. During that session, you're welcome to sort of post questions or comments in the chat thread, and we'll keep track of that. And then in the last sort of 10 minutes or so of that first session, my team and I will be keeping an eye on the questions that you do raise, and we'll put some of those questions or comments or themes to our first presenters for them to respond to. Then we'll have a quick break at around the 10:30 mark, just to give people a chance to go to the, have a quick bio break, as we like to call them. And then the second half of the session will be a case presentation. So one of our clinicians is going to present a case, which is just a lovely example of how we really enacted that key principle of building the child's relational health in order to get really positive outcomes for them. And again, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers during that session in the chat thread, and we will happy to sort of respond to those at the end of that session. Okay, let me just check. Just a note that the case materials, sort of case examples, etc., that are presented in this session, they've all been quite strongly de-identified. And in some cases, the examples we present might be a sort of an amalgam of different clients. So yes, even if the child or children discussed today sound very familiar to you, they won't be known to you because we've made a real attempt to maintain people's privacy by de-identifying as much as possible. Okay, so let's move on to our first presentation. Let me begin by introducing our first two presenters. So we've got Dr. Lyn Radford and Kathleen Wood. So Lyn and Kathleen are going to talk to you about the key principles for assessing a child's relational health and drawing on those relational connections as a key element of the therapeutic intervention. And they're going to obviously highlight the key messages from the practice guide, and they're going to be talking to you about some of the tools that are included in the practice guide. So just a little bit about who they are. So Lyn Radford, Lyn is the Take Two clinical manager for the South East and Gippsland division, and she's a clinical psychologist. Lyn is also one of the authors of that Frontiers paper that I mentioned earlier. Kathleen, or Kat, I can't help referring to her as Kat. When I talked about her as Kathleen, it sounds like I'm talking about a stranger. Kat's a clinical practice development consultant, so she's in my team. And Kat is also a certified NMT consultant for the program. Kat's a social worker and she's certified as an NMT trainer. Okay, over to you guys.
Thanks, Claire. I think I'm first up. It's really great to be here today talking about relational health in the context of the young people that we work with in Take Two. I have been feeling fairly anxious about today, as have the other presenters, and one of my anxieties is that my dogs will start barking. So far so good, except that they are snoring and there's some dreams. So Please excuse any background noise if it happens. I feel I need to put that out there. As Claire said, Kat and I are going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about the principles of assessing relational health. And Kat will also share some really great tools that can be used with young people, their carers and or their care teams. And these tools are also in our practice guide. So that'll be really handy. And then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So I'd like to start this conversation by talking about how important relationships are really to all of us, but particularly to those who've experienced trauma and or neglect. Humans, we're social animals. We're hardwired to form relationships from birth. Infants obviously need people to feed them and to keep them safe, but they need so much more than food and safety from the people in their lives. Relationships are essential to human development across all areas of functioning. So they're what we would call the crucial connections, hence the title of our practice guide in this clinical conversation, that support children to learn and grow and also provide a template for all future relationships. So our early relationships, particularly with our carers, are internalised and they become a map or a template for our future relationships. So infants and children who've experienced relationships that are safe, soothing and pleasurable will seek out relationships like that provide this for them throughout their lives. But on the other hand, infants and children who've experienced unsafe or harmful relationships will unconsciously expect this in all their relationships, even when the relationship is with a person who is kind, safe and nurturing. Positive relationships provide a secure base for the infant or child to manage stressful events, big and small, and to try new things. It supports them to develop self-regulation skills. They learn to problem solve and communicate. Their fine and gross motor skills develop, and they learn how to relate and be in relationships with others. Safe, pleasurable and comforting relationships support the child to learn how to feel safe and calm within their body and to regulate really strong emotions. So we also develop our sense of identity of who we are within the context of these relationships. So they play a really important role in how infants and children manage difficult life events. Children and families commonly experience adversity or trauma in lots of different forms. So it might be medical illness or procedures, ruptured relationships, separations, death, motor vehicle or other accidents. These happen in lots and lots of people's lives. But at a more extreme end, and certainly for the children that we work with in Take Two, their experiences have been of abuse, family violence, neglect, those kinds of things. The more extreme and or the more frequent these experiences are, the greater the impact on the child's development. It's interesting though, because children with a safe, attuned and healthy relationship will cope much better than those without these relationships. Because when children have access to this safe and supportive network of people, so the relationships, the impact of these adverse experiences, so whether they're minor, what we might consider minor compared to the kids that we work with, or even if they're more extreme, the impact of these experiences is reduced. And that's because the adult that's there can provide a source of regulation and comfort both during the event and the retelling of the event. So over time, the child's able to return to their base level of arousal. So the stress in their body in response to the trauma reduces or dissipates. And then the child's able to integrate the event into a narrative as something bad that happened to them, but that now they are safe, they have people that care about them and that they can turn to, and that the trauma that happened to them isn't about them or because of them. In other words, positive relationships have what we call a buffering effect on the impact of adverse experiences. They're protective. Unfortunately, when children experience chronic adversity and trauma in the absence of these safe and buffering relationships, what happens for these kids is they sit at those heightened levels of stress and arousal within their bodies. They don't have anyone to help them feel safe during or after the event, or someone to support them as they process and develop a narrative understanding. So this high level of stress and arousal within their bodies really impacts on their development across all areas. So I think you can see how important relationships are to development and also to buffer against adversity. So they have multiple roles, relationships. And also, there's a negative impact when there's an absence of these safe and supportive relationships. So there's kind of like that level of protective, where we have relationships that support and nurture us. There's an absence where we see that adversity to have an impact on children. But unfortunately, and again, particularly the kids that we work with in Take Two, the relationships that they are in are harmful. And so relationships that really should be safe, supportive and nurturing are sometimes unsafe, abusive and neglectful. So if you think about it, that not only does the child not have that buffer against adversity, they're also harmed within the relationship that's supposed to be caring for them. So in these situations, rather than reducing the impact of the event, it's likely to increase the impact. So it's not even that they sit at that high level of arousal, they're even more aroused and more constantly. And this increase really impacts on their development, and they often end up being, their development often ends up being delayed or disrupted. And we've got a really great case study coming up after the break that really illustrates this beautifully. So for kids in this situation where they experience trauma, such as abuse or family violence, within the relationships that are supposed to be caring for them, not only is there an impact on their development, but these kids also learn that relationships aren't safe and that relationships aren't a source of support, comfort, or joy. And then they associate being in relationship with others as scary or a source of harm. And their sense of self is also really negatively impacted, and they come to think of themselves as being bad or unlovable. And this in turn impacts on their capacity to have healthy relationships later in life. And as I was saying, these are the kids that we see in Take Two and that we're really talking about today in this session. So you can see how important relationships are and how essential it is to have an understanding of a child's relationship if we're to be trauma informed in the work that we undertake with these kids. So next I'd like to, I've talked about relationships, but I've kind of talked about it in a very broad and general way. The specific the specific relational needs of a child really depend on the individual, their age, their developmental stage, their template, their history, all of those things. So when we're working with kids who've experienced abuse, family violence and neglect, it's really useful for us to understand the relationships that they have available to them, both currently, but also what was available to them historically. So we use the term relational health to describe these relationships and to think about how healthy the relationships are. When we do use this term, we're talking about both the quality and the quantity of the relationships that are available to the child. So when I say quantity of relationships, I'm not just talking about the number of relationships, so obviously that is important. And sometimes too many is not a good thing, again, depending on the age of the child and the developmental stage. But we're also talking about the frequency of contact and the duration of contact. So do they see this person often? Do they have long periods of time with them? And then on top of that, it's not just the quantity that's important, it's the quality. So there might be lots of people in the child's life. They're certainly not alone, but the relationships may not all be healthy. So when we're talking about quality of the relationships, we're really thinking about what I talked about earlier about the best way for kids to develop is they need to be in regulating, safe and reward relationships. So relationships that provide this for the child, for this experience for the child, we consider those to be positive. And relationships that are dysregulating and unsafe, we consider them to be negative. And it's this combination of both the number and the quality of the relationship that helps us to understand if a child has had access to good enough relationships to buffer adversity in the past, and also if a child has access to good enough relationships currently to support their development and functioning. And when I talk about good enough, what we need when we're infants, if we're in, basically a fairly healthy family environment, we're mostly getting good enough care, we can continue in that kind of vein. But when kids have not had that from the beginning, that level of good enough when they're older actually is actually a much higher level. So the people in relationships with the kids need to be much more thoughtful about their interactions than they would be if the kids had grown up in a safe and regulating environment. So anyway, that's the way we think about relational health. So the history of relational health is really important. It helps us to understand what's happened, what experiences the child's had, and what relationships have been there to buffer the child. It also helps us to understand their development and what developmental stage things happened for them and who was there to look after them. So it's pretty complex, but we don't always have all of that information. But the information regarding the current relational health is often more readily available, and it's actually really vital to how we think about the child's relational needs in order to optimise their development into the future. Also, we know from research that the child's current level of relational health is the strongest predictor of their current well-being and their functioning. That's such an important point, I'm going to repeat it. So if you think about their current level of relational health, so we're thinking, is it positive, and how positive is it? That will be a stronger predictor of where they are, where their well-being and functioning is right now, than their trauma history. So you can see that we can all play a role in that recovery for the kids. But now I'm going to hand over to Kat to continue this conversation about relationships and to share some of these great tools that we've put together. Over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Lyn. Okay. I think you make a really interesting point, just to sort of pick that back up around considering the child's developmental needs, and that this can often be at odds with their chronological age, and that can be really tricky, I think, for us to hold these two bits in mind. And so understanding the child's history can help us to make sense of this, as you've been talking about. When we think of the child's history, it can be really easy for us to focus on the bad things that have happened and get preoccupied or focus on those. But trauma is not a diagnosis. And what I mean by this, saying this kid has trauma doesn't really tell us that much, because how trauma will manifest is very individual and will differ from child to child. A year of neglect for a baby, say, will have very different impacts on their growth and development compared to a year of neglect for a teenager. And so understanding those developmental experiences a child might have missed out on can give us some clues about what experiences we need to offer them now. And so in the practice guide, we've provided a number of different prompts to help you just to think about these for the children that you're working with, but also acknowledging that we do have quite a multidisciplinary audience with us today, lots of representation from different settings. So it's important for me to acknowledge that for some of you, it wouldn't be appropriate for you to be meeting with the child or with the family to take this history, whereas for others of you here in the virtual room, that's very much part of your roles. However, it's helpful for everyone, working with children, to think about how you can best get a sense of what the child's histories of relationships have been, and what this might tell you, or what this might mean for what they've learned about being in relationships with others. Just as, some examples or some prompts. So, when the child's upset, do they turn to adults to be comforted? Or if not, have they learned to soothe themselves? And what does this look like? Perhaps, they actually seek out excessive reassurance or support. It never feels quite enough. And so these children might feel, or, be viewed as very anxious or very clingy children. And considering also those interactions or cues that happen in being, in relationships. So something like a warm hug or eye contact or praise, all things that we learn being in relationship with others, particularly our caregivers in early life. These can seem like the right things to offer to a child, you know, in responding to them in a relational way. But for children who are relationally sensitized, and what I mean by that is for kids who can feel stressed by being in relationship with others, this can actually be really confusing or even scary or threatening for them. And why I've used that particular example is because it can be really counterintuitive for us, you know, for us to try to offer relational experiences that feel fine and okay for us, but they're not likely to necessarily feel this way for the child. And that's really important for us to remember, because relationships are the first step to healing. So the impacts of relational trauma must be repaired. They need to be repaired in the context of the child's relationships with others, and particularly those in the child's day-to-day life. And this needs to be done in a way that's tolerable to the child. And that's tricky, and we're going to unpack some of that today in the subsequent slides. At Take Two, we talk about this network, so the people around the child, this network of people as the therapeutic web. And this doesn't just mean that, you know, the professional therapists who might be involved with the child, but all of the people that are involved in the child's life who can offer the child positive experiences, or who can be supported to provide that to the child. And what's I find really encouraging is that even brief interactions that the child experiences as positive help to change neural networks in the brain. And this is particularly so when those experiences are consistent and repeated. And Dr. Bruce Perry describes these, and we use this term at Take Two as therapeutic doses. And just acknowledging, you know, that a carer or parent is going to have different interactions and experiences than, say, a teacher or other professional might. So when we think about therapeutic dosing, it is important to think about, you know, yourself and your role, and what that might mean for how you can provide the child with these safe and positive relational experiences. You know, so for carers, you know, it might be sitting alongside a child, sitting and watching a movie, or watching the child, you know, play on their video games. It may be helping the child to brush their hair or their teeth, all of which can be done in warm and engaging relational ways. You know, it may be helping a child settle into a new setting like kinder or school by doing this slowly with thoughtful transition plans, so separation is more tolerable for them. For the educators here with us today, you know, it can be things as small as a warm welcome, you know, an intentional warm welcome and settling the child in when they arrive to their setting. It may be sitting alongside them, speaking in a quiet, slow voice, you know, to break down a work task that might help them, you know, developmentally be able to respond to the work task in front of them. And for others here, it may actually be about supporting those people in the child's day-to-day life to be able to stay engaged with the child when things do get tricky, because inevitably they get tricky, but also potentially to build up the capacity of others to be able to work and to be relational with the child. And really what is essential is actually that the therapeutic web plan about how everyone in the child's, you know, an out-of-home care team or in the child's team consistently provide the child with therapeutic dosing that they need, really acknowledging that it's no one person's role and that everyone has to work together. And so I wanted to illustrate what this can look like in a very practical way, and the case presentation will also, in the subsequent, will highlight that in. But I wanted to talk you through our two tools that we've provided in the guide. So this being the first tool that's referenced, and this is, we've called this Me and My Week, and the first tool in our Crucial Connections practice guide. Both the tools help us to understand the child's current relational health, so they're about the present situation. And so I'm going to briefly just walk us through how you can use these tools. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to Justin. And Justin is a 10-year-old is 10 years old. And just for some very, very brief background, Justin came into the care of child protection after his mother relinquished care of him around, 3 years ago. His mum's always found it really difficult to care for him, and she attributes this to the fact that he was conceived in a sexual assault. She acknowledges that she feels differently about her daughters, whom she's had in her subsequent relationship with her new partner, who's Justin's stepfather. Prior to leaving the family home, Justin and his stepfather were having lots of conflict, and that this really contributed to his mum relinquishing care. And so when completing, when we're doing this tool with a child, first of all, I would encourage you, particularly for not just younger children, particularly when you're going to encourage drawing, to actually increase the size of the visual to an A3, to blow it up on the photocopiers if that's possible, just to allow, lots of lovely room for the child to draw. And so the first step is to ask the child to draw a picture of themselves in the centre. Some children might prefer to simply write names, but drawings really can help us as the professional to consider what the drawing might tell us about the child's own self-image. And this is something you might want to curiously explore with the child if that's appropriate for your role. And so we can see Justin here in the centre. And so the next step is, to explain to the child that this next ring is for the this next ring here is for the people that they see often. And so Justin lives in a residential care home after he moved through a number of foster care placements that ended abruptly and pretty negatively. And so these are the people that he sees most days. And so I'll just talk you through these quickly. So these people down here in the orange, he's represented as some of the residential care staff. And he describes these as people who feels just really just tell him what to do. He doesn't really feel like they have a positive relationship or many positive interactions, and he thinks they're pretty mean and unfair. He's separated this happy chap over here. This is Leo. This is another residential care worker, but the census Justin really describes him quite differently. They talk about doing fun things together, like skating. Feels like he can talk more freely with this particular worker. This cluster over here represents the grey and pink at his school. So this pink here is Miss Louise, his teacher, and a couple of the kids at his alternative education program. He doesn't really speak, doesn't really speak to them that much, but two kids that he sort of tends to work near at school. And here, Miss Louise, she's a new teacher for Justin. He's only recently moved to this school after changing locations to be placed in this new residential care home. Next on this is sort of this yellow band here. And so just above Justin, these two here are two mates that he describes. Sometimes he sees them a lot and at other times not as much. And so they're sort of in this middle band here. These boys are both 18 and reminding you that Justin's 10. So these are quite much older. I wouldn't not even necessarily say peers of his. They've got cars and licenses and they sometimes meet down at the skate park. Justin feels like they're pretty cool characters in his life. They smoke and drink and do pretty cool things. Recently, and you might see in this picture, one of them gave Justin some headphones, which he's drawn on himself here. And also importantly to his right, Justin, this is Justin's mum. He talks about her as, that she's pretty sad or angry a lot of the time. And, when this cross here, when we look at this cross, he just talks about that because, mum doesn't really give a shit about me. That's what that represents to him. Justin says he really likes when his mum comes to visit him on the weekend at his new home, but he does also say they often fight when she comes, and there are other times where she doesn't show up at all. And then this outside part of the tool, and sorry, I realized I was just looking because I'm looking at my other screen that I've got my cursor on, so sorry for my side profile. This outside of the tool here, this one over here, this is Nan. This is his Nan and her cat Boots. He talks about that he hasn't seen them for quite a while. You know, really when he came into care and there was a lot of movement, he really lost contact with his Nan. But when, you know, when we asked, you know, he really described that he misses his Nan, you know, and there's a warmness and tenderness when he talks about Nan, and actually, you know, really warmly about some memories that he had about Boots and some of the, you know, antics that Boots would get up to when he would visit. This down here at the bottom, in this bottom corner, are his sisters. He doesn't actually refer to them as sisters. He calls them mum's other kids. And really, he hasn't had any contact with them since he's come into care, so hasn't had any contact with them for 3 years, and they don't come as part of mum's visit when he comes to the house. And this, you know, pretty scary character over here, this is Justin's stepfather. He talks about him as being evil and that he really hates him. There's some quite strong language around here. So this gives us a really comprehensive picture from Justin's perspective of the number of relationships too. So the who, and in what sort of frequency. So how often he's having those interactions with each of those. And so throughout the conversation, so, you know, this is something that, you know, really aids a conversation and curiosity. So throughout the conversation, you know, that we're having with Justin, we're getting a picture of how it is that he feels about these relationships. However, the final step is, you know, asking Justin to choose some colors to show how he, you know, feels about the people in his life. And so what this is capturing is that quality, you know, from his perception. So you might remember Lyn saying the relational health is about both the quantity as well as the quality of the relationships available to the child. So that's what this is capturing. And so importantly, what stands out is that on a day-to-day basis, there's just actually an absence of the positive experiences we would be wanting Justin to have. He just doesn't have access to enough safe adults or connections. And so in these instances, we really want to think about how we can bring in others and build in these experiences in. And so this second image can help us to think about how we might plan for those things. And so these tools are, again, intended to be able to be used flexibly, you know, as Lyn was saying earlier, you know, whether it's with the child and the carer, the child individually, or with the child's care team, or, you know, the team around the child. And these tools have been designed to either be used independently or you know, paired really well together. And so for this particular tool, which is called the My Week tool, the first step is to record really what the current consistent opportunities are across the week for him, particularly in this from a relational perspective. So you can see even here, it's quite stark what is consistent. And again, you know, referencing back to what we know about how Justin experiences these, that school's pretty neutral for him. Like, it's a new school, it's not a particularly positive nor stressful relational setting for him. We know that mum, sometimes these visits go really well and other times not so much. So it's pretty unpredictable. As well, in this pizza night here, you know, this is the one thing consistently that happens every Friday night. And also, you know, this is one of the shifts that Leo seems to be on more consistently at the house. So something that Justin really looks forward to. So you can see there's just an absence across the week of those consistently positive experiences for him. And so this next image shows how we might plan to build those in. And I fully appreciate that this is not something that just can magically happen overnight because we put it in a, you know, put it on a nice, you know, planner like this. But, you know, it is something for the therapeutic web, for the adults involved to be working towards in a planned and thoughtful way. You know, how is it? What are the steps? What do we need to know and understand about Justin, about what his relation, you know, what he can tolerate? What is it that we know about his developmental needs? How is it that we can plan and respond to those in a thoughtful way? And so I'm not going to step through each of these things. And again, these can be done, this is quite obviously broad, because the absence to go really quite minute and break this down, that would have probably been too much of a leap for everyone. So we've gone quite broad as a starting point. For children who perhaps have more, you could break these down into more specific windows of time across the day and think about who's involved. But just to talk you through a couple of these things, one thing that to think about was, rostering Leo and Gaza, you can see here as another consistent person, rostering staff on in a more predictable way, but also when staff are rostering, having planned and intentional things for them to do together. So we've talked about obviously hoops here and Xbox, skate park, things that Justin really enjoys, that staff are intentionally on shift, going to try to engage Justin in, particularly the skate park with Leo. Will also, helping Leo to think about how it is that he could support Justin interact with peers closer to his age, possibly trying to disrupt maybe some of those inappropriate friendships or less desirable friendships that he's been making down at the park, and how it is that we can scaffold some of those social skills for him. But also, if Justin doesn't want to necessarily engage in a reciprocal way down at hoops or skate park or Xbox, how it is that we can still be present, the watching over, the encouraging, so that we can show that we're still relationally available. On a Saturday before mum's visit, you can see that we've intentionally built in a sleep in, and this is to make sure that he's feeling as well rested and best regulated in his body as possible before visits with mum that can be a little bit unpredictable. And with these visits with mum, really thinking about how it is that we can roster on someone who both Justin and mum feel more comfortable with, and also thinking about how we can plan an activity that mum and Justin might do. And this might not be something that they do intensely together in a reciprocal way where they're taking turns or sharing, and maybe this is if that's something they like to do, but even something that they can do alongside each other, to really set that visit up to be much more positive. And the last one I just wanted to highlight is also really how it is that we can intentionally reconnect Justin with his nan, who he did feel, he spoke about really warmly, and obviously shows a strong connection to. So how it is that we can intentionally reconnect, how it is that we engage nan as the adults to set that up to be, the most positive experience and reconnecting opportunity for Justin. And again, just acknowledging that, this is tricky. I don't want, to take one that this is easy. Kids who are relationally sensitized can often show resistance to us being, trying these relational approaches, and that can obviously bring up some pretty strong feelings for us, which, we wanted to really attend to. So I'm going to pass over to Lyn for our final bit of content, just to acknowledge the importance of staying patient and persistent with this way of therapeutically intervening with children. And thanks, Lyn, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thought that I unmuted myself. What I was saying was, thanks, Kat. They're really great tools, I think, that can be really helpful for us to think about what's going on for kids currently, and how we can improve their relational health now in the moment. And I think Justin's a really good illustration of how you might do that. So given that you're all here at this webinar, I figured that you are working with these kinds of kids. So lots of you will really already have, from first-hand experience, you'll know that these relationships can be quite tricky for kids that have experienced trauma and or neglect. So if we think about everything that Kat and I have talked about, it's kind of easy to see why it's so hard for them. They just haven't learned that relationships can be a source of comfort or pleasure, and they can't trust that a relationship is going to be permanent, or that the care might be unconditional. If we think about children, they're naturally egocentric. The world as they know it revolves completely around them. This is a normal part of development for all of us. So when they're like that, that's anything that happens to them or in their world, they see as their fault, because they can't see the world in any other way. So if they have experiences of abuse or neglect, and remember that it's often, well, nearly always from the people that are supposed to be caring for them, or they're exposed to family violence, again, within those kind of caring relationships, it's natural that they would think it's because of something that they've done, or because of something about them or who they are. So, it's really not surprising that their internalized sense of self is often that they are unlovable or that they're unworthy of care. And when they have this perspective of themselves, it's the lens through which they see the whole world. All of their experiences and their relationships is viewed through this lens of them not being a good person, being bad, not being worthy. And so when people are nice or kind to them, it can be really hard for them to make sense of it. They often feel, they might feel a bit suspicious of the person's motives. Why is this person being nice to me when I'm not a good enough person to deserve that? Or they pretty much will expect that they're going to be let down or rejected. So it's really hard when you're trying to have a relationship with someone who has that as their baseline experience of who they are. And then on top of that, just because they don't see themselves as lovable or worthy doesn't mean that they're just going to sit quietly and accept all of the crappy things that happen to them, from the everyday crappy to the more extreme crappy. They also have other lots of strong feelings that is going to drive their behaviour. Things like shame, a sense that things aren't fair. If you look at it from their point of view, they see what other kids have. They've got loving families, they've got stability, there's nurturance. It would be natural for them to feel that it's unfair that they don't have that. And then as a result of those feelings, and to try and manage those really strong, awful feelings, they might do things like lash out or take things that don't belong to them or tell stories that aren't true. And then that's really confusing for the people that are caring for them when they behave in this way, and even when people are trying to do the best for them. And again, another additional layer is their capacity to be in relationships, and the degree of the closeness that they can tolerate can change not only from day to day, but from moment to moment. So at any given time, they will be able to tolerate more or less of a relationship. And remembering that often relationships for them are associated with harm or abuse or fear. So there's quite a barrier they need to get past to be able to be close, and they can't necessarily maintain that for long periods. So sometimes what happens is you might be enjoying something together, having a really nice game or a conversation, sharing food, and then suddenly the child can no longer tolerate it, and they have an aggressive outburst, or they seem to go off in their own world, and it's often you don't know why that's happened. And then on top of that, I think for us, the relationships are really tricky too. They can evoke really strong feelings in us. And these feelings might range from, really strong desire to rescue the child, but also strong feelings of disgust or anger. And these are really normal responses that people have to these strong emotions that are evoked from the kids that we work with. And often our relationships can seem good and rewarding in one moment, and then the next moment it feels like you've gone backwards. So at the very least, for those people in the kids' lives, it's confusing. And so these strong feelings, you might kind of feel frustrated when the kids just they don't seem to get along with other children, or you might feel hurt when they yell and swear at you after you've done something nice for them. And then it's really easy to react in the moment in an angry or punitive way. So what's important for us is to stop and notice these strong feelings that we're experiencing, and find a way to understand them. So just pausing for a moment, regulating ourselves before we respond, taking a few breaths to calm ourselves, and reminding ourselves that the behaviours that are evoking these strong feelings, so the things that the kids are doing, are really just survival strategies for the kids. Their earlier life experiences have taught them that this is what they need to do to keep safe, to survive, to have their needs met. So to summarise that a little bit in terms of what these important things are, pause, step away from the situation. So when you feel these really strong feelings inside you, and you can feel your own stress levels elevate, your heart rate goes up, you're feeling angry, or you're feeling like you want to punish, normal feelings, just take a moment, step away from the situation. Like if you really can do that physically, that's great. If you can't, then do it psychologically. You absolutely need to regulate yourself. You need to find a way to bring your heart rate down and to kind of be a bit more calm in your own body. You can take some deep breaths to calm your mind. You might need to go for a walk. So if there's someone else that can kind of step in for you in that moment while you do that to calm down and to clear your mind, that's great. And during that time, reminding yourself that the child is most likely misreading your intentions. Although they are safe, they might not feel safe. And again, as I said before, the child's behaviours are survival strategies. They're the only way that the child knows how to manage the situation or circumstances. So one of the things that I have always felt the need to do when I have really strong emotions when I'm with a child, and look, I don't care for kids, so the brief periods that I spend with them, it's much easier, but I'm human and they evoke strong emotions in me. And sometimes, and it can be emotions of sadness. It's not necessarily anger. Sometimes I can feel overwhelmingly sad in the moment. I kind of switch to that more cognitive side of myself and really help myself to calm down and to be more regulated by thinking about what's going on for the child. And I always try and remember kids do well if they can. So this is not deliberately about me. It's the child's needs that they're trying to meet with this behaviour. And then after that, if you can relate and co-regulate. So if you have a good relationship with the child and you know what you can do, what the child likes, you can use that relationship to help the child to calm down. So if you think about the things that work for them, you know, they're the kinds of kids that would be helpful to do some regulating breathing activities, some yoga or stretches or something like that. Or is it better to do something alongside them, like going for a walk or shooting some hoops? Often for the kids that we work with, that kind of physical activity has also sort of has some sensory benefits as well. And that can be a really great way for both of you to calm down together. And then also thinking about how you kind of use yourself to regulate them. So is it a calm and soothing voice that they respond well to, or are they better if you're just a quiet and calm presence? Definitely do things alongside them so that they know that you're there for them, but not in front of, not at them, because that can feel a bit confrontational. And you need to kind of be led by them in terms of the closeness, how close you physically stand, and don't ask for explanations or as to why they've behaved in that way. They won't know. That information's not available to them. What's important to them is that you help them to regulate, to bring their stress levels down. And then you can start to be doing some thinking together, but much later on. So the kids that we work with, all of their needs are going to be really individual to them. There's not a one size fits all approach, unfortunately. And there's often a lot of guesswork and a bit of trial and error. You're human, so you'll get it wrong. And in fact, you need to. That we can't provide a world for these kids that's perfect, where no one makes mistakes and no one lets them down. It's about repairing after that. And the only way the child will learn how to repair, how to kind of fix those relational little ruptures, big or small, is if there's someone there that can help them to do it. So if you can guide them and support them to actually fix that rupture, that's a lesson in and of itself about people being there for them and being consistent. But ultimately, patience and persistence, they're absolutely the key to success in these relationships. And then finally, what I would say in terms of relationships with these kids is you really need to remember to be kind to yourself, cut yourself some slack. If you do get it wrong, Or if you don't know what's going on, that's okay. Just keep trying, take the breaks that you need, get the support that you need, and do the things that you need for your own self-care so that you can keep going. Particularly for those of you that are in caring roles or in roles where you're with the kids for long periods of time, you will know that you can't take care of others unless you take care of yourself first. So there's probably just a few things, key things that we think would be good for you to remember from this little presentation today. So earlier I described the importance of relationships and explained the term relational health. Remember, that's the quantity and the quantity of the relationships that are available to the child. And I think a key point to remember is that the research has shown that the greatest predictor of developmental well-being for the child is their current relational health. So that means it's important to consider who is in the child's life right now and how positive the relationships are with the child. And Kat's tools, I think, were really, really useful in helping us to understand that for each child. And that leads us really nicely, I think, to the next key point, which is creating a therapeutic web of people to provide the therapeutic dosing. And again, Kat's second tool, the My Week tool, I think that's really helpful in us just understanding the day-to-day relationships and activities that the child has in their day, whether they are neutral or positive or negative, and how we can improve upon them, and to think about how to measure the therapeutic dosing and then adapt it specifically to the child's needs. And remembering you're not going to just suddenly want to fill their day every day with positive relational interactions, because that's likely to overwhelm them. So everything with balance, everything, you need to take your time. As I said, a bit of trial and error. Sometimes you'll try something and it won't work. It might be that it's just the wrong time, or it might be the wrong thing. So need to kind of keep thinking. And then finally, what I've just been talking about now, patience and persistence. This is such hard work, and some days will feel harder than others. But remember, the child's doing their best to survive. Be kind to yourself. Take the time out when you need it. Ask for support, because you will need it so that you can be patient and persistent. That pretty much concludes mine and Kat's presentation, and we might have some time for questions, Claire.
Thank you, Lyn, and thank you, Kat. That was fabulous. We've actually had lots and lots of comments and questions in the chat thread as you've been talking, and I've tried to sort of answer most of them as we've gone. There, you know, maybe just to sort of summarise, really, just for people who might have missed them. There was a question around thoughts on using the Me and My People tool. Thoughts on educators using that with students, and you know, my response was that I think that it would be sort of most wise for if someone in the school staff is going to do that with a student, to kind of focus on the child's view of relationships in the school context, because if they start to uncover the child's view of relationships outside of the school context, that's not to say you shouldn't do it, but be mindful of the potential consequences around that in terms of what might be unearthed. So yeah, you wouldn't leap into that without thinking about what you might actually be told by the child. We did have an interesting question which I haven't responded to, which, oh, sorry, I can't remember who, I think it came from Flo, and it was, the question was, is relational mapping effective for children with a disability, particularly, for example, autism? And I guess, Kat or Lyn, I'm not sure if you would like to respond to that. My gut response is yes. You know, it certainly could be done. And I do know that we have a speech pathologist in the group with us, and, you know, that she has provided some Joy has provided some nice advice to people around, you know, thinking about if you're working with kids or young people, or even adults who might have be on the autism spectrum or have cognitive impairments, thinking about communication tools that to help facilitate that
those
conversation.
Conversations. Yeah, that would be what I would be certainly encouraging. And I guess to talk to both points is that the tools are intended to be used with intention, so that these aren't just universally adopted and for every kid that you ever, it really needs to be done about in a thoughtful way about why and what your role is, about why it is that we would be needing to understand these things with the child, and is that your role, and what you would be doing with that information. I think that's an important point to make, and certainly when working with children with whether developmental delay or speech and language difficulty, or I would be thinking about we would be leaning on our supports at Take Two with the speech pathologist around what visual aids might be most appropriate and how we use those aids to scaffold conversation, because conversation in and of itself might be too much, and so I guess how we would pair those things together and be guided. But it will be very individual. For some children with ASD, and this would be completely appropriate, and then for others it may not be. So really being led by the child and the child's developmental capacity, but also being really individual and intentional about when you would be using these tools would be what I would suggest.
Thanks, Kat. Look, I'm just aware of the time, and I'm seeing a couple more questions coming through in the chat, so we'll answer those in the chat thread as we go. But let's have a 5-minute break. So my clock says it's 10:31. So have a little bio break, get up and stretch, use the bathroom, get a glass of water, and we'll see you at 10:36. All right, welcome back everyone. We've had our 5-minute break. Hopefully that's given you a bit of a chance to refresh yourselves. So following on from that fabulous presentation about the kind of key principles of understanding relational health and working to kind of build the child's relational health, we're now going to listen to a case study. So I'd like to introduce you to Adrienne Buhagiar. Adrienne's a senior clinician with Take Two in the Eastern Metropolitan team. Adrienne is a, sorry, just lost my notes. Adrienne holds a Master's of Professional Psychology and she's a registered psychologist. She's also a certified child parent psychotherapy practitioner. Adrienne's particularly skilled, I think, in working with young children and their parents and carers. So Adrienne's going to tell us a story about a little boy that she worked with who we've called Moses, and just to sort of stress again that this case is de-identified. And I'm going to be sort of talking with Adrienne throughout this presentation, but this is primarily Adrienne's piece of work. So I hope you enjoy it. And as I'll be busy, Adrienne and I'll be busy in this presentation, my colleagues, Kat will respond to questions in the chat thread, and Jen will continue to respond as well. So please keep the questions and the comments coming, because it's really lovely to see those. Okay, Adrienne, let me...
Hi. Oh, hi. Thanks, Claire, for the introduction. Like Claire mentioned, I'll be presenting a case study and we'll be referring to this little boy as Moses. So at the time of the referral to Take Two, Moses was 3 years old, but almost 4. And Child Protection made the referral to Take Two and were seeking really an assessment of his current functioning, but they were also quite interested in understanding Moses's relationship with his mother, Kathy, and also really were interested around Kathy's ability to be, I guess, emotionally connected to Moses, and really how she understood Moses as well. So the referral to Take Two was really made in the context of a pretty tricky history for Moses and Kathy. And he was, like I said, almost 4, but his history really dated back to when Mum was pregnant with Moses. So unfortunately for Kathy, when she was pregnant with Moses, she developed some psychosis during her pregnancy and began to experience hallucinations and delusions. And then what happened is, when Moses was born, there was some pretty immediate concerns raised around Kathy's really ability to connect with Moses. And so she was immediately placed into a mother and baby unit. some of the things they noticed at that really initial time were that Kathy really struggled to respond to Moses, and so he would be left crying for long periods. She had a real lack of motivation at times to feed him or to soothe him, and that she wasn't really enjoying the little moments of cuddling or nurturing that you might expect in those really early, first days after Moses was born. Following that, they were discharged after a small period of support from the mother and baby unit. And they did go to live with a family member for a really short period and then went to live on their own. And what happened really after that, all the way up until, unfortunately, when Moses was around 2 years old, is that Kathy continued to experience sporadic episodes of psychosis. And then she was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia when Moses was 2 years old. So following the diagnosis, it was really great that Kathy received the care that she needed, and she was supported by a community mental health service, was given medication to manage her psychosis. And then following that, she no longer experienced delusions or hallucinations. However, there was a real change in her presentation and her affect. So she was reported to be, and at the time of my involvement, was quite had quite a flat affect, displayed limited emotion. She also was very tired a lot of the time and would say that she needed lots of sleep in order to cope as well. And she was really just having, again, a tricky time understanding Moses as well. So that continued right up into our involvement. And the other thing I think that's really important to note at the time of the referral is that Child Protection were quite worried about neglect. So due to Kathy's history and the medication she was taking and sleeping lots, she was actually leaving Moses for long periods on his own to entertain himself, and they were worried about the home not having, many toys or developmentally rich experiences for Moses during that time. It's also really important probably to note at this point that unfortunately, Kathy had her own history of childhood adversity. So there was a history of parental mental illness for her parents, and she also experienced or was exposed to family violence as a child too. So that's kind of the history of Moses and Kathy. At the time of the referral, Moses was also experiencing a range of difficulties himself. He had a diagnosis of global developmental delay at this point, and he was also on the waiting list for an autism assessment. He had delays in his speech and language. He had delays in his fine and gross motor skills, and he also had delays in his social and emotional skills. So he was really struggling to connect with his peers. And he was also explaining some kind of internalizing behavior. So he would withdraw quite regularly, would curl up into a ball, and would shut down really quickly. So that was some of the things that were happening for Moses. And at the time of referral, he also did have, so he was going to childcare 5 days a week. He had NDIS early intervention funding, and he had access to an integration aid. But what I probably noticed is that the services, unfortunately, were not working very collaboratively. And many of them were working kind of in isolation at the time.
So Adrienne, yeah, that you paint quite a rich yet sad picture of Moses' early life. And I guess, so would it be fair to say, based on the information you had about Moses' life before he was referred to you, that, if we think about what Kat and Lyn were talking about, that his sort of formative templates about relationships and what relationships look and feel like were largely set by his experiences with his mum, Kathy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't mention he was living full time with Kathy at the time of the referral. However, he also did have a kinship respite placement, but it was quite minimal at this point. And so the assessment really focused on, for me, like Kat and Lyn mentioned, really understanding how those experiences of relationships are sometimes being scary or harmful, especially during those episodes of psychosis and when mum was not well, really impacted his current functioning and how Moses was presenting at the time of the Take Two assessment. So next, really what I will talk a bit about is his really understanding Moses's relationships around him at the time of the assessment. So these are some of the things that we did, or we do really, as part of our Take Two assessments. So one of the things that we did for Moses was a working model of the child interview. And that's an interview that I do with a parent. So I did this with Kathy, and it really helped me to understand really Moses's individual relationship with Kathy, but it's also a really great tool in helping you to understand how, well, for me, how Kathy really, her insight into Moses's thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and how she really viewed Moses in the world as well. So some things that I noticed from that assessment were, really sad for Moses and Kathy at the time. Unfortunately, Kathy, I think due to her multiple episodes of psychosis and also her current functioning at the time, really struggled to see that Moses had any difficulties at all. And so at the time she reported that, he was perfectly fine. And she was quite concrete in thinking, well, he's growing and developing and physically healthy. And she wasn't able to really see the developmental delays or some of the other concerns from the adults or the professionals around her. So that was really quite a worry for me at the time. The next thing that we did is the carer-child interaction assessments. And the particular assessment that I used was the Crow procedure. And that's quite a structured assessment. And it's quite good in helping you to get a range of different observations in quite a structured and short period of time. I did that assessment with Kathy and Moses, but I also did that assessment with Moses and his kinship carer, James, just to help me to establish some of the differences in the relationships, because children can present very differently in different relationships. So in that assessment, we looked at, there's moments of free play and imaginary play. There's quite structured activities. There is moments of separation as well. And there's also a reunion. So I get quite a range of information from that assessment. And unfortunately, again, what we noticed during that assessment was that Kathy and Moses, unfortunately, really played in isolation or separately for most of the time. There was limited eye contact, limited moments of that to and back and forth interactions that we really like to see. And there was also not much joy or playfulness in their interactions. At one point when we did the separation task, Kathy again really struggled to prepare Moses for that separation, and she really quite abruptly left the room. However, what I noticed from Moses was that seemed to be perhaps something that happens regularly for him, because how he responded, which again was quite sad, was by laying quite still on the floor, and he softly sang to himself for the 3 minutes of separation. And it really appeared to me that he was really trying hard to soothe himself and to remain calm and settled, and settling himself. When Kathy returned to the room, there was limited joy again, or there wasn't really much of a reunion, and they kind of went back to being in the same room, but very, very separately as well. When I did that observation or that interaction assessment with his kinship carer, I did see quite a lot of differences. And so in the moments of free play, there was some really lovely mutual joy and laughter. And what I really loved was the working really collaboratively in those activities that they were doing. The other thing that I noticed is that the developmental tasks or the structured tasks were quite hard for Moses because of his delays. But James was really able to scaffold him and prompt him and encourage him throughout that time, which was another great sign.
Did you notice a difference in his use of language between when he was with Kathy and when he was with James?
That's actually a really good point. The silence in the observation or the assessment with Kathy and Moses was quite profound at times. And so really actually not talking to each other at all. And so there was definitely lots more language, lots more, and now we're going to do this. And then when you do this, and those instructions and preparation, which is, you know, really great scaffolding for little people. The separation task went quite similar, which I was not very surprised about that, if that's Moses's kind of way of coping with people leaving. But what I did see was a really lovely reunion. There was lovely moments of nurturing where James would get lip balm and put it on Moses's lips for him. And when he returned, you could see the smile on Moses's face and the joy. And Moses actually crawled into James's lap and they just cuddled for the remainder of the assessment. So you could really see that connection, which was great, but also, I guess, concerning in that he didn't have that experience with his primary caregiver. So yeah, after we did that, you know, we did our normal kind of interviews with parents and childcare and professionals, getting more of an understanding of his history and his experiences. And
so I might just pause there, because you said we did our usual, but it's probably important to kind of stress that that might not be usual for lots of sort of practitioners out there, but that is a key part of the way Take Two works, isn't it? Is to really get as much information as we can from the key sort of context that the child currently is in, and sometimes even has been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't go into that too much, but we look at, you know, developmental history. So what happened to the child at different points in their development. We do observations at childcare and interviews to see, you know, how do they present at childcare? What are their struggles? What are their strengths at childcare? And we also speak to the professionals, especially child protection, around their, you know, maybe child protection history or service history as well.
Yeah.
So that's that, you know, probably a component of the Take Two role as well. So really from all of that information that I've mentioned, I gave a diagnosis to Moses that is not a diagnosis that I make frequently, which is called specific relationship disorder of infancy. And really that diagnosis description is in the title. It's when a child's presentation or the concerns regarding their presentation are quite specific to a particular relationship. And I really did notice with Moses that the real, you know, in that relationship, there was some real significant difficulties around emotional connection. I didn't feel that he had a secure base, or it was someone that he sought comfort or connection from with his mother, Kathy. And at times I felt that there was a level of fear potentially, or finding it really confusing around that relationship. And I think that really did relate to those early experiences where mum was probably a bit unreliable, or, you know, sometimes was quite scary, but then also at other times was quite, you know, loving or connecting. So from that, Take Two did make some recommendations around some time-limited but intensive intervention. And we really wanted to firstly focus on seeing whether we could support Kathy to develop that insight into Moses and how Moses might think and feel. But we also wanted to give some really practical and on-the-ground support to her relationship with Moses. So we did something called video interaction guidance, which is where I initially would get Moses and Kathy to play for around a 20-minute period, and I would watch from the observation room. And then I would enter the room and we would do some more play and interactions. And that whole session would be recorded. The first part was around seeing how they interacted on their own. And the second was with, you know, scaffolding and me role modeling interactions and seeing how Kathy responded. So we would do that. And then about 2 days later, really tried to keep it quite soon after those sessions, we would watch the video. Kathy and I would watch the video together. and we would look at, you know, what we noticed in those videos, what was maybe the tricky parts, what went well, and then make really concrete plans of things we might try and work on in the next session as well. And they were things like, can we really try and have more eye contact? Can we, sometimes Kathy would respond in very similar ways, which seemed to not really get the response she was hoping for, but she would consistently apply the same approaches instead of maybe being flexible. So trying different things like that as well.
I imagine people are a bit curious. When you say you videoed, what did you use to actually video? Did you use a camcorder or an iPad or?
Yeah, well, I think at times I had to get a bit creative, and so I did sometimes have, you know, the I'm not very good with technical tech's not my area, but I would just use like a handheld camera, or at times even just, we have iPads at Take Two. And when our fancy video recording system works in our offices, we also would use that as well, which would record like a camera in the corner of the room, which was much easier, because little people and iPads in the room don't always go very well.
Absolutely.
So, so that just really a range of different things depending on what I had on the day and what was available. But definitely iPads and iPhones are all really great tools to use for people, obviously. And I find the videos work so well because sometimes you can, like the speech pathologist mentioned, you can talk about these things, but when they see it with their own eyes and that visual representation of an interaction, it's quite powerful. In that moment. So yeah, they were the things that we did. But unfortunately, what we noticed is that, again, the same things that I saw in the assessment period really didn't shift. And so unfortunately, Kathy would sometimes make statements around not really understanding why Take Two was involved, still not really feeling like Moses had any difficulties or that there was a reason to change or shift in her approaches to parenting. And also, I think one of the things that I developed more information was really around Moses' experience of the relationship with his mum. And so in the videos, it would normally only be really around 5 minutes or so before Moses would start to ask for me. And he didn't know me too well at this point. And so I thought that that was an interesting response. And he would say, oh, where's Adrienne? When's Adrienne coming back? And he would actually go and sit at the door of the room and curl up into a ball. And really Kathy was unable to bring him back from that, or I guess engage in that co-regulation that Lyn mentioned is so important for a child to, you know, get them to feel confident and safe in interaction with a caregiver. So yeah, that was a bit of a worry for me at the time. Also to add that what happened is after that formal Take Two assessment and then during the interaction guidance, unfortunately, Moses did go to childcare and was limping at the time, and he made a disclosure that his mum had hit him in the leg. And following that disclosure, Child Protection decided to remove him from his mother's care, and he was formally placed in the kinship placement on a full-time basis. Sorry, I'll just add one more thing. The other thing that also happened was that he did have his autism assessment. However, I thought it was really great that in collaboration with Take Two, we discussed that although Moses had a range of really concerning developmental delays and presentation, we wanted Moses to have the opportunity to have a safe, or, you know, increased relational health and safe relationships, and you know, a more developmentally enriched placement before an autism diagnosis was made. And so we decided that we would pause on that and that he would be re-referred for another assessment in approximately a year time to see whether something else could be done before that diagnosis was made.
And that's a really interesting point, because someone in the chat thread has made a comment about you know, their concerns about how children can be sort of diagnosed with things like autism and so on, and other disorders, without their trauma and neglect experiences necessarily being taken into consideration. So yeah, I think this case is a very good example of not necessarily saying that this kid definitely doesn't have ASD because they have got a trauma history, but just holding both considerations in mind while we while we sort of do the intervention and get more information.
Yeah. And I think the severity of his neglect and those experiences were so profound to me that I really wanted that to be considered, and an intervention to maybe be targeted at that before a diagnosis as serious as autism was made for Moses. So you'll see here in the next slide that we did use the tool in a bit of a different way that Kat used it, and that was really because Moses was 4 at the time of using the tool. And really what we did was we used the tool with his primary caregiver at the time, which was his kinship carer, James, as well. We really wanted to think about Moses and increasing his relational health and his therapeutic web in this assessment. The intervention. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we did that. So the main goal was really around increasing Moses's access to healthy relationships, and not just again about quantity, but really looking at thoughtfully at those relationships as well and how they could be improved. And we really wanted Moses to have more experiences of relationships as safe and as a source of comfort and pleasure, and not as scary. So they were really our key goals for Moses. I need to also point out at this time too that at the time of removal, there were some increased trauma symptoms that were present that we weren't really aware of originally. And so Moses developed, we started to see some scratching. So he would scratch himself quite absent-mindedly as well. And this would actually, and he would do this when he slept, where he would bleed. He was having frequent nightmares and night terrors, and he required significant settling and soothing to be able to sleep in his own bed. He became quite significantly attached to James, and he experienced quite significant separation anxiety when going to childcare as well. He would cling on to James and he would cry, and it was really quite hard for James to leave him in the childcare environment.
And that, to me, that sort of sounds like that reminds me of when I took my own very young children to childcare. That sort of behaviour sounds more like that 12 to 18-month-old rather than a over 3, nearly 4-year-old child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also too, it was interesting that I think he had finally had this access to a really incredible, I have to say, an incredible relationship. And so when he got it, he didn't want to let it go ever, really.
Yeah.
And so James and I really wanted to work hard on giving him more people that he could experience that with as well, because we didn't want James to be his only healthy relationship. So that was really the psychoeducation that we did to James and his partner, Jessica. And the first thing we did was try and help with the childcare. And so we put in place some really thoughtful transition plans. We would have a regular person, like we said, and this is where maybe school or a childcare come into it. A regular, consistent person would meet him at the entrance and give him a really warm greeting. They would also then, James would go into the centre with him and would stay for a period, and we slowly reduced that over time. And we also did use positive reinforcement as well, finding something that he really liked and was a good initiative for him to go and to want to be at the childcare. The next thing that we did was Theraplay. So Theraplay is a therapeutic intervention that is really quite targeted at enhancing and building attachment for children. It has really great co-regulation moments, and it's really playful. So we did that intervention It's a dyadic intervention, so that means that we did it with Moses, and we decided to do that with Jessica, who was the female kinship carer, because again, we wanted to broaden those experiences of healthy and positive relationships. And Moses really loved that, and that worked quite well as an intervention. The next thing that was important was around shifting the NDIS support to be more therapeutic. And so we went to something called a key worker model, which meant that Moses only had one worker for speech and language and also for OT support. And that was, again, regularly built into his week, where they would come once a week and they would have support sessions around speech and language and OT. And another factor that was incredibly important for Moses was a mentor. So this was really quite organised by James, who was great. And it was someone that they knew from their community, who was a registered support worker through NDIS as well. And once a week, we had it built into his, my week kind of calendar, where he would have just really fun and nurturing and relationally connecting time together. I think it might have been once or even twice a week, and it was normally an hour or two at a time. And they would do all the fun things that Moses liked to do, like scooter riding and going to the park and the toy library and lots of fun things like that. So that was another area that we worked on. And then I think the last thing, which was a really important part, was how could we think about increasing the quality of Moses's relationship with his mother, Kathy. And so what we decided to do was that Moses absolutely needed to have time with his mum. However, it needed to be, especially at the start, with someone who was secure and safe for Moses present. And so James and I decided that once a week, Moses and James would go over to Kathy's house, and they would all have a lovely dinner and a meal together. And James and I really worked closely on noticing when maybe Moses had had enough or reached his kind of window of tolerance and was becoming overwhelmed. And James became really great at being able to, I guess, be that kind of bigger, stronger, wiser adult and stepping in and saying, okay, probably time to go home or finish up. And so that contact became really positive. And actually, I think for Kathy was also great because it never really got to the point of someone becoming overwhelmed or disengaged or, shutting down, because they were really good at noticing when that was probably enough for everybody as well.
Yeah, so the sort of interactions that really had concerned you during the assessment between Kathy and Moses, that improved because of the way that contact was set up, having those evening meals together?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think, like I said, it was just crucial that there was somebody else present at the time. And so Moses he had his secure base of James, and so he could go and interact with Kathy, but he knew that he could go back to James when he needed to. And so I think that allowed him to be a little bit more present and a little bit more just safe in those interactions with his mum as well.
Right.
Okay, moving to the next one.
Yep. Oh God, sorry, I'm having issues with my technology.
Great, thank you. So this is my last really slide, and this is really about some of the outcomes that we saw, and it was really quite a lovely outcome for me and the work that we did. So Take Two were involved for almost 12 months, and we had a planned closure that actually coincided with Moses being placed on a permanent care order to James and his partner, Jessica. And so we kind of closed at a similar time to that happening. And throughout, when we closed, we normally do a review and we see how the child's tracking compared to when we first started. And there were some really significant shifts for Moses that occurred. So one of the main things was the reduction in the trauma symptoms. And so at closure, his scratching had actually completely ceased. And so he was really no longer scratching at all, which was great to see. He also was no longer having night terrors or nightmares and was sleeping in his own bed independently, which was lovely. And he also was no longer scared or had difficulty separating from James when going to childcare, which was a really big outcome because, you know, that was causing distress for James and Jessica as well when that was happening. So that was good too. So
can I just, when you say that you sort of use, at review and closure, you measure, you measure progress, it's probably important to just let people know how we do that. So in terms of the trauma symptoms, did you use the trauma symptom checklist?
Yes, I did. So we do at Take Two have a range of clinical measures that we use. So at assessment, I did the trauma symptom checklist, the adaptive behaviour scale, assessment scale, and also the neurosequential model of trauma report, which we completed too. And ages and stages, which is a really easily accessible developmental screener as well.
Right.
So we did all them at assessment and at closure. And so the next thing, which was his NMT report, which showed that his developmental risk had reduced from being in quite the high range to the low range. And that was based on, no longer being exposed to any adverse early life experiences, but also that really significant relational health increase. And that, I guess, there was an intervention really focused on that as well.
Yeah.
His developmental functioning increased significantly. So he had significant increases in his speech and language. His fine motor skills increased, and childcare were reporting things like much better skills in relating with other children within the childcare. So, increased eye contact, lots more reciprocal play. So playing with other children rather than playing over time. On his own, which was really great to see. And increased adaptive behaviour. So on that adaptive behaviour scale, he went from the extremely low and low range to below average and average range in most areas, which is 2 standard deviations increase, which is a really great, great change or shift
significant,
in a 12-month period. School readiness had increased, and so he was, by the time I was finishing, he was getting ready to start school, and Kinder really felt like he was ready for that, which I was quite surprised at, really, considering it had only been 12 months. And one of the big things too was that, the care team really no longer felt like he met the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So his relational skills, his social skills, his understanding of other people's emotions and social communication had all just increased dramatically. So it's really quite a different boy to when I first met him. And yeah, that's really the summary of the Take Two intervention.
Lovely. Yeah, it's such a great story. I guess I'm interested in because there were services involved. So you mentioned that there was a speech therapist and an OT and so on, and there had been an integration aid at childcare, etc. But in your kind of view, was it those specialist services that kind of helped him to catch up in those developmental areas? Or do you think it was more about that he was actually, once he was with James and Jessica, that he was just getting more of the day-to-day opportunities, sort of exposure to, play and speech and routine and fun and all those things, that exposure to opportunity was actually what made the biggest difference?
I personally do think that it was the relationship that was the biggest factor, that, unconditional positive regard and that connection. And they just truly loved this little boy in all of his different areas and quirks and different things like that. So I really felt like that was the biggest thing. And I think if you think about that therapeutic dosing, naturally, James and Jessica really provided therapeutic dosing for him. And we did speak about that, and we thought about, you know, even on their tough days, what's those little moments that we can think about to support him. And so they really took that on board. And across his week, you know, if we did, you know, something like a My Week tool, you would have seen a major shift in all those opportunities that he got for those connections. And I think they don't just offer relational connection, they offer exposure to developmental experiences, co-regulation, you know, many different things as well.
Yeah, that's great. Look, I've kind of been keeping an eye on the chat thread as we've gone, and there's been, you know, a few questions and so on. Kat or Jen, were there any questions that you'd kind of like to share with us now, or any themes that you felt were coming out of the chat thread?
There certainly was a lot of discussion around the diagnoses, Adrienne, which I think you can imagine, and I guess how, you know, clinicians and practitioners, you know, who may be working with children who have lots of sort of diagnoses or different diagnoses, and how you make sense of that alongside the trauma history. And Laura's just posed a question now around also wondering how these extra services was funded when Moses didn't have a diagnosis, and that, because that can be really tricky to do.
Yeah, yep. So I might be good to answer. So the NDIS early intervention funding is a fantastic resource. And it's actually, you don't need a diagnosis, or no, you might need a diagnosis, but it's not as strict a criteria as a child who is above the age of 7. So they're only eligible for that up until 7 years old. But it's a really great thing to tap into. And, you know, normally with pediatric review, it's quite easily accessible as well. So that's something always good to think about for the little ones as well.
Oh, yes, Joy's just shared in the chat thread. Just need to show delay into, oh God, now I've lost it, to developmental areas.
Developmental areas, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other sort of themes or questions that you identified, Kat?
I guess there are some people have been really interested in all of the different tools and things that you've done in Adrienne. I guess that does stand out. It was really quite a comprehensive assessment and using the different outcome measures. And so there's a sense of, I think people are very interested in all of those things, but also I wonder, very overwhelmed with the volume of things that you did to understand Moses and then respond and intervene. So I don't know if you wanted just to make, I don't know, comment on some of the challenges, and maybe for those that aren't in, say, clinical settings like Take Two, how they might think about those things in their role.
Yeah, I think, you know, Take Two, like we mentioned, is quite an intensive therapeutic service. So we're really very fortunate that we have the ability to provide a service that does, I guess, give a real wraparound of therapeutic needs for a child. But I still think, you know, some of the tools that we mentioned earlier, and, you know, I tried to connect it to the intervention, really show how, even, like I said, it doesn't have to be these big, massive clinical interventions. Like those little moments of therapeutic dosing, if they're predictable, and consistency is a big one, are really instrumental in the work that we do. And I think they're things that most people can think about when they're relating with children as well.
Thanks, Adrienne. It's something that the guide talks to, that there certainly are instances and children that you'll be working with who are required to be referred to services such as Take Two or other specialised services for this comprehensive assessment. And so the guide attends, you know, talks to that, but also in your roles, there are things that we can be doing on a day-to-day basis as well. So how we hold both of those in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was thinking about some of the interventions that you use, like video interaction guidance, for example. You know, that's something that you know, people can do training in, and, you know, should practice, but it's not, you know, you don't have to be qualified to use that. It's a simple way of working with a parent or a carer and a child, where you video and then you just simply watch the video and talk with the parent about what they notice, and you talk about what you notice and have a bit of a discussion about what the parent is seeing and what that might mean to them, and then exploring maybe what the parent thinks that might mean to the child. And that's something that a lot of practitioners can do. It's got a good evidence base, particularly with parents a bit like Kathy, who have really complex issues themselves. It's not a complex or reflective or highly sort of cognitive or highly reflective strategy. It's more about just noticing concrete interactions and experiences.
Yeah. And I would also say that Ages and Stages is a really great tool that's quite readily and easily available, and is a really good screener for picking up on things, and those kind of early interventions, especially for quite the little ones, which I'm very passionate about. But
and I think someone in the chat thread said they were very keen to hear more about Theraplay, and I think someone shared the link. Yeah, there's definitely, if you just Google Theraplay, you can get lots of really interesting information about that. Yeah. All
There's
right.
also been, Claire, quite a few comments, and not necessarily questions that need answering, but about the misdiagnosis and ready diagnosis of ASD, when actually it's just trauma and lack of relational health for a child. So just want to acknowledge that that's something that we find also in Take Two.
Yeah, and I think it's I think we have to be really careful about it. It's often it's not one or the other, and we get that question a lot in Take Two: is it ASD or is it trauma? Is it intellectual disability or is it trauma, for example? And it's a bit simplistic to just sort of say, well, it's all just trauma. If we know that this kid's had trauma and neglect in their history, we shouldn't be making a diagnosis because maybe it's just the trauma. It can be both, and there can be real benefits to a child receiving a diagnosis, particularly in terms of access to funding and services, but also for some kids and some families, that having a diagnosis kind of helps give a bit of meaning and understanding around some of the challenges that the child or family has been experiencing. So yeah, I think it's really important to kind of hold complexity and tolerate that it's often both and. We actually have a recording, if you go to the Berry Street YouTube channel, there's a recording of a forum that we ran last year, and the first presentation in that forum was given by Dr. Sandra Radavini and Morel Lynch. So Sandra Radavini is one of our partners from Mindful. She's a psychiatrist, and Morel Lynch is one of our clinical managers, and they had a conversation about exactly this, about the sort of the complexity of the systems that we work in, the complexity of the presentations of the kids that we work with. Yeah, so if you like the sound of that, that's about a 1 hour, 45-minute presentation. You can access that recording, because they really explore some of the challenges around holding multiple lenses when we often are driven to try to find a sort of really simplistic or black and white answer to something that's far more complex than that. All right. I think that brings us to the end. What I'll just do is I'll just speak to this very last slide here. So as I said earlier, we've got one more practice guide coming out later in the year, and that'll also be aligned with another one of these clinical conversations webinars. So please keep an eye on the Relate newsletter. So if you haven't already subscribed to the Relate newsletter for Take Two, please do so, because that's the best way of getting information, sort of up-to-date information about specific dates, specific, what the specific topic for the practice guide and the clinical conversations will be. The Relate newsletter also has information about other training that we deliver from Take Two, and also, broader Berry Street. You can always go to the Berry Street and Take Two websites. So yes, we really look forward to seeing all of you again. Please share the information about these clinical conversations with your colleagues and throughout your networks, and please encourage your colleagues and networks to also subscribe to the newsletter so that they get access to these opportunities as well. Thank you, everyone.